Ask a Vietnam veteran what ruined missions, and most people expect a familiar list. Enemy fire, bad intelligence, weather, equipment failure. Those things happened, and they mattered. But if you stay with the question long enough, if you let the conversation slow and the memory settle, another answer often surfaces. Something smaller, something quieter, something that wasn't wearing a uniform. Veterans will tell you about plans that were solid on paper and rehearsed in detail, only to unravel in the field for reasons no briefing covered. A patrol that stopped moving, an ambush that never happened, a recon mission that turned into an evacuation before contact was ever made. These weren't dramatic failures. There were no explosions or after-action headlines. The mission simply fell apart. If you're a veteran watching this, you already understand how fragile control was in Vietnam, how quickly momentum could vanish, how a single unexpected problem could cascade through an entire operation. For everyone else, this is what needs to be understood. In Vietnam, missions didn't just fail because of the enemy. They failed because the environment refused to cooperate. Wildlife played a role in that far more often than most histories acknowledge. These weren't Hollywood moments. No heroic last stands against animals. What happened instead was quieter and more frustrating. Wildlife interfered at exactly the wrong moment. It broke silence. It injured the wrong man. It delayed movement just long enough for a window to close. And once that happened, the mission was over. Night ambushes were among the most vulnerable operations. They depended entirely on discipline, silence, and timing. Units moved into position hours in advance, often crawling into concealed locations and holding still through darkness and fatigue. The success of the ambush depended on remaining unseen and unheard until the precise moment contact was initiated. Wildlife did not respect that silence. Soldiers described nights when animals moved through their positions without warning. Monkeys crashing through branches, birds erupting from trees, small animals running through undergrowth and kicking loose debris. To an experienced unit, these sounds were different from human movement, but in the moment, certainty didn't exist. Every unexpected noise forced a decision. Hold position and risk compromise, or reposition and lose timing. In some cases, ambushes were abandoned entirely. Not because the enemy detected the unit, but because the unit could no longer trust its own concealment. The longer wildlife moved through the area, the greater the risk that the enemy would notice something was wrong. The plan dissolved without a shot fired. Snake bites caused even more direct mission failures. Venomous snakes were an occupational hazard in Vietnam, and their bites were not something a unit could ignore. A bitten soldier required immediate attention. In many cases, evacuation. That single injury could cripple an entire operation. If the point man was bitten, movement stopped. If a radio man was bitten, communication became uncertain. If a medic was bitten, the unit lost its primary lifeline. Even when the bite wasn't fatal, the swelling, pain, and risk of complications forced leaders to make hard decisions quickly. Veterans recall patrols turning around miles from their objective because one man stepped wrong. The mission wasn't lost to the enemy. It was lost to time. The delay meant daylight would catch them in the open, or extraction windows would close, or enemy movement patterns would shift. The jungle didn't need to strike often to win these moments. It only needed to interrupt once. River crossings introduced another set of variables that wildlife could exploit. Operations often depended on crossing water quietly and efficiently. Any delay increased exposure. Crocodiles, snakes, and unseen movement beneath the surface made soldiers hesitant to linger. In some cases, crossings were postponed until daylight. In others, units rerouted entirely, losing the element of surprise. That delay mattered. A missed crossing window could mean missing the enemy entirely, or walking into a different situation than the one intelligence predicted. Once again, the mission didn't fail dramatically. It simply no longer made sense to continue. Disease operated more slowly, but its impact on missions was even broader. Mosquitoes didn't stop patrols in a single night. They degraded units over weeks. Malaria, dysentery, and infections steadily reduced manpower. Soldiers were pulled from missions before they ever began. Squads operated under strength. Fatigue increased. Mistakes followed. Commanders planned missions assuming full strength, only to find themselves adjusting on the fly as men were evacuated or confined to medical care. The mission might still go forward, but not as planned. Roles shifted. Coverage thinned. Risk increased. Rats caused problems inside the wire that rippled outward into operations. They destroyed food stores, contaminated medical supplies, chewed wiring, and disrupted sleep. A soldier who hadn't slept properly for days was not at peak effectiveness on patrol. Multiply that across a unit, and the impact became noticeable. Wild boar and monkeys created different kinds of chaos. Boar moving through dense undergrowth could sound exactly like a patrol. Units froze. Ambush positions tensed. Weapons were raised. Time passed. Tension mounted. By the time it became clear the movement wasn't human, the rhythm of the operation was broken. Monkeys were worse in some ways. They learned routines. They moved boldly through camps. They knocked over equipment and stole rations. They triggered noise at the worst possible times. A carefully prepared listening post could be compromised by animals moving through it repeatedly, making it impossible to distinguish meaningful sound from background chaos. None of this appears in traditional mission reports. After-action summaries rarely note wildlife interference. They record aborted operations, delays, or altered routes without explanation. But veterans remember why those decisions were made. They remember the frustration. They remember lying still for hours, only to have an animal crash through their position. They remember the anger of turning back after days of movement because one man needed evacuation. They remember missions that never happened, not because of enemy resistance, but because control slipped away. This was one of the most exhausting aspects of Vietnam. Not the firefights, but the constant erosion of plans. The sense that even when everything was done right, something could still go wrong for reasons beyond human influence. Wildlife didn't need to kill soldiers to affect the war. It only needed to interfere at critical moments, to break silence, to slow movement, to injure one man at the wrong time. In Vietnam, that was often enough. And once a mission lost its timing, lost its secrecy, or lost a key member, it wasn't heroic to push forward. It was reckless. Leaders understood that. Veterans remember the orders to pull back, regroup, and try again another day. The jungle didn't care about objectives. It didn't care about schedules. It didn't care how important a mission was. Wildlife acted according to instinct and opportunity, and that indifference quietly shaped outcomes. By the time soldiers rotated home, many carried memories of missions that never made it into official histories. Plans that unraveled without contact. Operations remembered not for what happened, but for what never did. And for those who lived it, the lesson was clear. In Vietnam, losing control for even a moment could mean losing the mission. And wildlife was often the reason control slipped away. Not every mission in Vietnam failed at the moment of execution. Many were compromised long before the first step was taken, weakened quietly by conditions that never appeared on operations maps. These were the missions that never truly had a chance to succeed, not because of enemy action, but because the jungle and its wildlife steadily eroded the bodies and readiness of the men assigned to carry them out. Mosquitoes were the most effective of these forces. They did not disrupt a patrol in a single night. They dismantled units over time. Malaria, dengue fever, and other mosquito-borne illnesses pulled soldiers out of the field days or weeks after exposure. Men who had trained together and planned missions together suddenly disappeared from rosters, evacuated not by helicopter under fire, but by medical necessity. The loss of even one soldier altered a mission. The loss of several changed everything. Squads went out under strength. Roles were reassigned on the fly. A machine gun team lost a man. A radio operator was replaced by someone less experienced. A patrol designed for a specific strength moved forward with gaps that could not be fully closed. Commanders understood this, but they had little choice. The war did not pause for illness. Missions still needed to be attempted, even as units slowly hollowed out from within. Leeches contributed to this erosion in ways that were rarely dramatic, but always persistent. River crossings and flooded terrain left soldiers with bites that bled longer than expected. In isolation, these were minor injuries. In Vietnam's heat and humidity, they became infection risks. Swelling, inflammation, and secondary infections reduced mobility and endurance. A soldier with an infected leg could still move, but not at the pace the mission required. Over time, these limitations added up. Patrols slowed. Rest periods increased. Schedules slipped. By the time a unit reached its objective, fatigue had already taken its toll. Jungle rot was another silent mission killer. Constant moisture softened skin and destroyed the body's natural defenses. Feet broke down. Fungal infections spread. Open sores formed where boots rubbed against damaged skin. Marching became painful. Standing became exhausting. Yet most soldiers pushed through, unwilling to be the reason a mission was delayed or aborted. That determination came at a cost. Units reached insertion points already depleted, their effectiveness reduced before contact ever occurred. The jungle did not need to stop a mission outright. It only needed to weaken the men enough that mistakes became more likely. Rats inside fire bases played their own role in this process. They contaminated food, damaged equipment, and disrupted sleep. Soldiers who had not rested properly for days were sent out on patrol with dulled reflexes and shortened tempers. Fatigue became a constant companion, one that no amount of discipline could fully overcome. Sleep deprivation altered judgment. A tired soldier reacted more slowly. He misinterpreted sounds. He hesitated where decisiveness was needed. Missions depended on sharp awareness, but wildlife ensured that rest was always incomplete. Insects added to the pressure. Swarms of ants invaded positions, biting exposed skin and forcing men to move when they needed to remain still. Wasps and bees nested in trees and embankments, turning routine movement into sudden chaos. A single disturbance could send insects pouring out, breaking silence and scattering men at the worst possible moment. These incidents rarely made it into reports. They were inconvenient, embarrassing, and difficult to explain in official language. But veterans remember them clearly. They remember lying motionless while insects crawled across exposed skin, knowing that any movement could compromise the mission. Disease compounded these problems. Dysentery, skin infections, and fevers drained strength and focus. Soldiers operated while sick because the mission demanded it. Over time, this constant strain degraded unit cohesion and morale. Men grew short-tempered. Patience wore thin. The margin for error shrank. By the time a mission reached the planning stage, it often carried hidden weaknesses no one could fully account for. A patrol looked ready on paper, but in reality, it was composed of tired men carrying injuries and illnesses that had not yet forced evacuation, but had already reduced effectiveness. Wildlife did not need to attack directly to influence outcomes. It only needed to exist within the environment long enough to wear soldiers down, to sap strength, to steal rest, to open the door for mistakes. Some missions were postponed because too many men were unfit to move. Others went forward despite those conditions, only to be scaled back or aborted when reality proved harsher than planning assumed. Objectives were missed. Opportunities passed. Intelligence went uncollected. These failures were quiet. There were no after-action reports praising enemy resistance. There were no medals or citations. Just frustration and the understanding that the jungle had once again dictated terms. Veterans later reflected that this was one of the most demoralizing aspects of the war. Not being beaten by an enemy, but being worn down by an environment that never relented. Wildlife was not malicious, but it was relentless. The jungle did not choose sides. It did not care about mission importance or timing. It continued to feed, bite, infect, and intrude regardless of objectives. And in doing so, it shaped the war in ways that are still rarely acknowledged. By the time many soldiers realized how much these forces had affected their operations, their tours were nearly over. The missions that never happened were forgotten by history, but not by those who planned them, rehearsed them, and then watched them dissolve under pressures no one could fully control. Not all missions failed slowly. Some unraveled in seconds. These were the moments veterans remember most clearly. The instant when everything was in place, when silence mattered more than anything else, and when a single disruption collapsed hours or days of preparation. Listening posts and night ambush were especially vulnerable. They required absolute stillness. Men lay motionless for hours, sometimes entire nights, fighting cramps, insects, and exhaustion. Every sound carried meaning. Every movement had to be deliberate. Wildlife did not understand that discipline. A sudden burst of movement in the brush could trigger a chain reaction. Weapons tightened, breathing slowed. Men froze, unsure whether the sound was an enemy patrol or something else entirely. When it turned out to be an animal, the damage was already done. The position had been compromised. The unit no longer trusted the silence around them. Sometimes animals passed through positions repeatedly, making it impossible to distinguish real threats from background noise. The longer this went on, the greater the risk that the enemy would notice the disturbance. Leaders faced a decision with no good outcome. Hold position and hope the jungle quieted down, or withdraw and lose the mission. Many chose to withdraw. River operations carried similar risks. Timing was everything. Cross too early and visibility increased. Cross too late and extraction windows closed. Wildlife in the water forced hesitation. Crocodiles were rarely seen, but their presence was enough to change behavior. Soldiers moved faster than planned, skipped safety checks, or delayed crossings altogether. Those delays mattered. A missed crossing could mean missing contact with an enemy unit entirely. Intelligence went uncollected. Opportunities vanished. The mission ended without engagement, leaving behind only frustration and unanswered questions. Even inside fire bases, wildlife interfered with operations. Snakes entered bunkers. Rats moved freely through defensive positions. Monkeys learned routines and exploited them. These were not emergencies, but they chipped away at order and predictability. Sleep suffered. Equipment was damaged. Tempers shortened. Fatigue accumulated. A tired unit made mistakes. Not traumatic mistakes, but small ones. A footstep placed carelessly. A sound misidentified. A movement made too quickly. Wildlife amplified these risks by ensuring soldiers were never fully rested, never fully comfortable, never entirely in control of their surroundings. Veterans recall moments when a mission was called off not because of enemy action, but because conditions no longer favored success. The jungle had shifted. Noise levels changed. Men were too exhausted. Someone was injured in a way that could not be ignored. These decisions rarely appear heroic on paper, but they were often the right call. Pushing forward under compromised conditions invited disaster. Leaders understood that. So did experienced soldiers. The result was a war filled with missions that ended quietly. No contact, no firefight, just a radio call, a change of direction, and the long walk back. History rarely records these moments, but they linger in memory. For veterans, these experiences shaped how they understood Vietnam. The enemy was dangerous, but predictable in ways the jungle was not. Wildlife followed instinct, not tactics. It appeared without warning and disappeared just as quickly. It could not be deterred or negotiated with. This constant unpredictability changed how soldiers thought about control. Plans became flexible by necessity. Confidence was tempered by experience. Even the best preparation could be undone by something no one had anticipated. Over time, many soldiers stopped thinking in terms of winning or losing individual missions. Survival and adaptation took priority. If a mission failed without contact, it was frustrating, but it was also understood as part of the environment they were fighting in. That understanding followed veterans home. Years later, many still remember the missions that never happened, the ambush that was called off, the patrol that turned back, the objective that was never reached. These memories carry a different weight than combat stories. They speak to restraint, judgment, and the quiet acceptance that not every fight could be forced. Wildlife did not decide the outcome of the Vietnam War, but it influenced countless moments within it. It interrupted plans. It degraded readiness. It stole time, energy, and certainty. And in doing so, it shaped the daily reality of the war in ways that are easy to overlook. If you're a veteran watching this, none of this will sound unfamiliar. You lived in an environment where control was always temporary and plans were always fragile. You remember the moments when the jungle itself seemed to push back. For everyone else, this is an important part of understanding Vietnam. Not every mission failed because of the enemy. Some failed because the environment refused to cooperate. In Vietnam, that was often enough.